Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my first bit of MSI 2023 content on this channel, and it's actually going to be something that I'm pulling from my Worlds content last year. You guys really enjoyed when I did this for Worlds 2022, and so I'm bringing it back here for MSI. It's going to be the meta report video. I don't typically talk about meta. I don't typically talk about the picks that I expect to see at a tournament because, quite frankly, it can be pretty difficult to predict. A lot of teams can be very set in their own ways, and they can see the game very differently, and obviously pros in general definitely see the game a little bit differently from each other and then from the general populace, so it can be sometimes a little bit difficult to predict what we're actually going to see at major international events. But you guys really did enjoy when I did this last year, and I think it's important to talk about some of the changes that we could be seeing from what the playoff meta was at the end of every major region into what we are going to see at MSI and who that could potentially benefit. So that's what this video is going to be. If you guys are interested in this, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, leave a like on it if it's something that you really do enjoy. Of course, you can wait until the end of the video to do that as well to see if you actually like the video, but without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. This is going to be structured very similarly to last year's video. It's going to be broken up into a couple different parts. The first part, we're going to talk about all of the buffs that are happening on 13.8. I will lightly mention any buffs on 13.7 that I do think are, consequential, influential, because obviously we haven't seen that patch in competitive either, and so it's worth noting that the changes from both are going to be at least a little bit relevant. I will then be going into the nerfs, doing the same thing, and then I'll be going through each of the 5 positions, talking about the picks that I consider to be tier 1, and then the picks that I consider to be tier 2 in each position, maybe some tier 3 picks thrown in there as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick this off. I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time. We're going to be starting it off with the champion buffs here in 13.8. Up on the screen, every single champion that got buffed, or at least the champions that consequentially got buffed on 13.8. We'll go ahead and talk about what ended up changing and whether or not I think it's going to matter. The unfortunate part about this video, I really like the concept and the idea for it. Not a ton of consequential changes through the last couple of patches, but I'll talk about the ones that I do think are going to change. The one that I think is going to be, one of the more interesting ones to at least see if pros actually care about it at all is going to be Kog'Maw. I actually think that his changes in this patch in 13.8 are actually kind of interesting. He got a couple of different changes. Mostly the passive, I think, is going to be the one that people look at the most. He hasn't had his passive changed his entire release cycle, since he's been launched, and now he's getting quite a few buffs to that, which I think is actually really positive. The damage is going up, and you get ghosted when you die now in the passive, and I think generally speaking, that's actually kind of an interesting feature. Pretty much guarantees that if you go super aggressive on a trade in the earlier mid-game, that you're going to be able to trade 1-for-1, because you're going to be able to get that passive damage off, so long as, obviously, you don't get absolutely obliterated in the fight, which I think is generally, good. It gives Kog'Maw a little bit more reliability, is I guess the way I would put it. I don't think it's obviously great, because you still have to die to activate your passive, and that's not exactly what you want to do as Kog'Maw, but it does give you kind of an out if the fight is incredibly close. Now that you're ghosted, now that it deals more damage, it's going to be a lot more likely that you're actually going to be able to get something out of it, which I think is certainly interesting. The ability changes. The Q cooldown gets negligibly shorter. It's nice, it's 1 second, but it's not like you're really spamming Q on Kog'Maw anyways. And then the E, I think, is a little bit more valuable, I guess I would say. The mana cost ends up getting buffed. The slow ends up getting buffed on the E. That's the ground that comes out for Kog'Maw. And I think both of those are going to be a little bit more interesting, but overall, I don't think this really changes, everything about Kog'Maw. What you want to see for Kog'Maw to be strong in Pro is either incredibly good AP scaling so that he can become this big artillery, ult range champion in the mid lane, in the late game, or, he just needs to be able to be that turret that can sit there and auto attack over and over and over again. I'm not sure any of these changes particularly upgrade that playstyle in the way that I think a lot of people might want him to be upgraded, but I do think they matter, I think, more than a lot of the other quote-unquote buffs on this patch. I do think that the Kog'Maw changes are some of the ones that I think we're going to see the most impact. I'm not sure we're going to see Kog'Maw at MSI, but at the very least, they're trying to get him back into meta a little bit. A champion whose changes I actually really do like is Lilia in the jungle. I actually think that there are a couple things that are really going for her on this patch. Obviously, we'll get to the Cosmic Drive changes in just a bit, but those help her out a lot, obviously. And then she also gets quite a bit of a buff onto her passive in multiple different ways, mostly damage and survivability. You're going to get a lot of healing off of that passive now as well, and that's going to make her jungle clear a lot better. That's going to make her trading a lot better. That's going to make her contestability for a lot of early objectives objectives, things like crabs, things like Herald, a lot more consistent. And honestly, I think she's probably the champion that got the most out of this 13.8 patch, which I think is really good considering I already thought she was relatively playable. I certainly didn't think she was bad by any means. We've seen players pull her out and feel relatively comfortable playing her. You do need to play around her a bit more than some of the other junglers that I would consider top tier, the facilitators, junglers that I think are going to be better at facilitating that bot lane playstyle that a lot of teams have gone to. But I do think Lilia is good if you want a jungle, I don't want to say carry, because, Lilia isn't exactly the hyper carry that some other champions are in the jungle, but something aggressive, something you can play around, and something that's there for damage. I think Lilia was already pretty good at that, and I think that the upgrades to her passive honestly only made her better at that. And so a champion that, especially with some of the players that are going to MSI, Yike in particular, I think definitely could see play at this tournament with the Cosmic Drive changes, with the passive changes, just a lot of things stacking that I do think makes Lilia more viable. I don't know how much more viable. We'll get into that when we talk about the jungle champions, but I like the changes for Lilia. And then the other, I guess, notable, big changes here in 13.8 is a buff to Leona, and it's a buff to her W in multiple different ways. She's getting a ton of armor and MR on the W, which is really nice for early trades, I guess. Usually when I see armor, MR, and then we'll talk about it, the damage also going up in terms of Leona's W, I'm like, oh, top lane. That's the first thing that pops into my mind is Leona top is now a lot stronger, but I really, really doubt we're going to be able to see anything like that at MSI. I don't think this impacts Leona all that much. It gives her more survivability. It just makes her do what she already does a little bit more efficiently, and people were already starting to get back onto the Leona hype train by the end of playoffs. We saw a lot of teams, especially in the West, teams like Golden Guardians pulling out the Leona a lot more, consistently, and I think with, picks like Nautilus and Thresh and Blitzcrank coming into meta and being pretty popular right now, I do think that Leona certainly has a niche, and I certainly expect to see her at MSI. This basically just makes the champion a little bit better. I don't think it changes her playstyle. I don't think it turns her into, an S+ tier support, but I do think that it takes what she already did well, and I think it makes it a little bit easier to execute on. And then I'm going to kind of run through a lot of these other changes because a lot of them don't matter. I'm going to be entirely honest with you. Starting with Ezreal, his base AD is slightly buffed. Great. I don't actually think this matters at all. I think this affects basically zero things, especially at Pro. People that were going to pick Ezreal are probably still going to pick Ezreal. Karzi's probably going to pick Ezreal. Stixxay's probably going to pick Ezreal because those players play that champion. But if you're not playing Ezreal, this isn't going to change your mind about playing Ezreal, in my opinion. Garen gets a slight buff to his base AD and his base armor. Okay, I think this is more consequential than Ezreal. I don't think it changes all that much. Garen still is a counter pick at Pro. He's never going to be someone who's just going to be ridiculously strong in any matchup because he just doesn't offer all that much outside of his damage. And so if he's not, absolutely dominating the laning phase, there's really not a point to picking him. And so, this is a nice buff. I do think it lets him do the early game a little bit better, it lets him play the early game a little bit better, but again, not something that I think is going to impact all that much. I'm going to group a couple of changes into kind of one here. Janna and Nidalee kind of going together, both of them getting buffs that I think help low elo solo queue a lot more than they help high elo and pro play. Janna ends up getting more damage on her W, and the E shield decays a lot slower. It's nice, but it's not really going to matter because pros time the E well, and the W damage really isn't consequential. You're still not going to be picking Janna over things like Lulu, over things like Soraka, over things like Nami in those particular circumstances. I don't think that this is a change that raises her up in the priority that high, but it is something. And then same thing for Nidalee. Again, these buffs were very actively directed at low elo players, trying to smooth out her solo queue curve, and so I'm not exactly super sure it's going to matter at the pro level, but again, we've got a lot of Nidalee players at this tournament, and so maybe they see any buff to Nidalee, and they're like, ooh, buff to Nidalee. It was just, I think, more armor and armor growth in the early game so that she can clear a lot easier, but again, high elo players, that's not really going to matter. They're kiting camps well, and so then you've got Poppy. I actually think this change could matter, especially if they do more to her in the future. They added more damage to the Q and added more resistances to the W, just kind of made her stronger. We've kind of been missing out on Poppy over the course of the year. A huge pick in 2022 out of that jungle. I still think that Poppy's utility is very good, and I think, comparatively to a lot of the other junglers, she actually matches up really well into what is currently meta. Even things in the top lane, things in the support position, I think she does relatively well into what the current meta is right now, and you know, maybe these changes do enough to be able to push her into the meta, but I don't think by themselves they are enough. I think if they added on to this in some future patches, it definitely could be something. And then Kha'Zix's Q damage is up. Kha'Zix is never going to be relevant in Pro. He's just not. If you're coordinated as a team, you're not going to be isolated. He's not going to be able to deal the damage. He's not really all that good in, you know, the team fights around objectives, which is basically what the entirety of the Pro meta is right now. And so while Kha'Zix is a little bit of a menace after the couple of changes at low elo in solo queue, he's probably going to get zero play in Pro. I don't expect, no matter how good they make him, that he's ever really going to be all that consequential. And so when you look at the buffs this patch, really not a lot of like ones that matter, I would say, all that much. Lilia probably the one that I think is going to stand out the most to me personally. And then Kog'Maw, Leona, Poppy, I think those changes could matter. Even something like a Nidalee, just to get people playing her again, I think could matter. When you look at 13.7, really only one of the changes in 13.7 I think impacts the current meta that we're going to see, and that's the buffs to Azir. And I shouldn't say buffs, they are buffs, but it's kind of a changing of how the champion wants to operate. What they did, big buffs on the W, they lowered the cooldown, they upped the damage, which is, you know, they want you to try and max this now, they want you to try and be a little bit more of this late game hyper carry, and they nerfed the Q to try and make him more of this, you know, less of this lane dominant mid laner, this poke dominant mid laner in the early game. And I honestly kind of like this change. It makes him a little bit more useful in the late game, a little bit less useful in the early game, and I think that actually might make his play rate go up. You know, pros love playing Azir. They're always going to find an opportunity to pick that champion if they have the opportunity to, and I think this just gives them a little bit of a reason to. I'm not exactly sure if he's going to be like top tier. I think that mid lane's so open right now that nobody is going to be like this meta-defining mid lane pick. I just don't think that we're in a place where any of the mid lane champions are strong enough to be considered that, but I think Azir could definitely get some play rate at MSI with some of these changes. It certainly makes his late game team fighting more consistent, and again, if that's going to be the case, if you're going to be able to deal more damage late game, then, you know, that's music to pros' ears, typically speaking, and so that's really the only buff I would say on 13.7 that is really all that influential. But Azir, Lilia, Kog'Maw, the champions that I think were a little bit out of the meta by the end of, you know, the spring split and by the end of playoffs, that maybe have an opportunity to get back into it now here at MSI. And then looking at some of the champions that ended up getting nerfed on this patch on 13.8, it's more the same story, if we're being completely honest. It's more changes that did happen, but I don't really know how important they're going to be. I think pros might look at them and, you know, be on the safe rather than sorry side and kind of maybe move away from some of these champions, but for the most part, I don't think that any of the core playstyles of any of the champions that have been nerfed over the last two patches have really changed all that much, with the exception of one, and even then, I really only think it's partially, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but up on the screen, you'll see the 13.8 nerfs. Starting left to right, we're going to talk about Aurelion Sol. His health growth and armor growth were nerfed. Fine, whatever. I mean, this matters not at all. Like, this is one of the least influential changes that they are going to make on the patch. Aurelion is still going to be exactly who he was on 13.6, on 13.5. If he scales into the late game, he's going to deal a ridiculous amount of damage, and if he doesn't, it doesn't matter, right? Like, no damage changes for A-Sol. He's still going to be a problem. I understand that maybe the survivability is a little bit worse here, but even then, I really don't think that this change matters at all. All the situations that you were seeing Aurelion in before this nerf, I think you're going to see him in the same way. If teams feel confident playing a champion that doesn't really have an early game to scale into the late game, then they're still going to pick Aurelion here. It's not going to change all that much. Jarvan, I think, is definitely an interesting nerf. He's needed something for a while in solo queue, but I do think he's been in a relatively interesting place in pro, whether that be as a jungler or as a support, as we've seen kind of pulled out in multiple different regions. But he received a base AD nerf and a nerf to his Q damage. Now, I do think that this could matter, especially for early clear. That's really where I think things start to change, is when you start getting less damage in the early game, you know, base AD, the Q damage in particular, you know, that's really where it comes to mind, is the clear speed. And if you're not going to be able to keep up with what is a really fast jungle clear meta right now, then, you know, we could really see him fall out of meta in that part. But in terms of team fights, like, he's probably only getting one Q off anyways, and if he's not, then, you know, this isn't really going to change all that much. Like, it's not really going to matter. And so for J4, I do think that this impacts his early game, especially out of the jungle position. We could see players that have liked to pull him out, players like River, who is going to the tournament, that have really liked the J4. We could see him move away from that pick, go to something a little bit more consistent, maybe stick to what the meta junglers have been throughout the last few months. But, you know, I think if you really want to force him, it's not really going to matter all that much. By the time you hit the mid game, you're probably going to be in a similar position with J4. It's just the early clear that I'm a little bit worried about. Kayn got nerfed. Doesn't matter at all for pro play. He got his Shadow form, his Shadow E nerfed. Whatever. It's fine. Yeah, like, great. Congratulations, Kayn. You've been dominating US solo queue in the top lane by proxy farming. It's kind of annoying, but this nerf was not for pro. Malphite gets nerfed as well, another champion that's been really good both in pro and in solo queue over the last few months, but again, not a full gutting, just kind of small changes, small nerfs, not really wanting to take away the core playstyle of the champion. It's the W that gets nerfed on Malphite, that's the empowered auto. It's going to get nerfed on damage, and the armor shred is going to get nerfed a lot as well. Now, this doesn't really matter. Again, for early trading, yeah, maybe a little bit. And then even in team fights, right, maybe you're going to get a couple of W's off in a fight and you're going to be able to do that. But for the most part, like, Malphite's still going to do what Malphite does. He's going to be a menace in the late game. He's going to be able to shut down, you know, heavy AD comps, and that ultimate's always going to be really good. Like, that core play style of Malphite has not changed. The reason that you are picking Malphite has not changed. He's just going to be slightly worse in the early game, slightly worse at being able to trade with picks that he was able to trade with on the previous patches, and then, you know, maybe some of those extended team fights, he's not going to be dealing as much damage, but still, if you're setting up for the rest of the team, and if you're building full tank anyways, then it's just not going to matter all that much. I do think it's in that similar boat to something like a Jarvan, where it's like, yeah, I could see this kind of maybe dissuading some of the people who really liked Malphite, but the core reason that you picked him in the first place is not being adjusted, and therefore, I don't think it matters all that much. And then for Rakan, just a little bit of scaling back on his power in the early game. His base armor and his armor growth have both been nerfed. They want his survivability down, and I understand that. He has a lot of survivability right now with the mobility that he offers, with, you know, just the fact that, you know, he can basically just charm anybody in the middle of a team fight and really get out scot-free. Like, I understand wanting to get Rakan, you know, out of the perma top pick in the meta, and I do think that this matters, at least in the early game, but those situations where you were early picking Xayah Rakan, like, those are not changing. Xayah is still incredibly strong. She has not received any sort of touches over the last few patches, and so Rakan is still going to be highly prioritized in that same vein, but, you know, I think outside of that, maybe his priority in other lanes goes down a little bit. He still offers a ridiculous amount of CC, and even with the armor, you know, going down, his survivability in the early game going down, I don't think this matters, like, all that much towards his survivability. He still has the mobility, he still has the ability to jump back out after he goes all in a team fight. There are still a lot of options for Rakan. I don't think that his innate survivability is absolutely destroyed by him having his armor nerfed here. And so those were the big nerfs, and none of them really changing all that much. Jarvan, Malphite, Rakan, definitely going to, you know, in certain circumstances, feel the nerfs, in my opinion, but none of them are really going to have to change their playstyle. They're just going to have to do it at a slightly less efficient clip now, which, you know, I don't think really matters all that much for teams that have been practicing these champions all year long. Now, 13.7 changes, a little bit more direct in terms of the ones that they wanted to nerf on that patch. All three of the major three junglers across this, you know, year so far were nerfed on 13.7. Sejuani, Vi, Wukong. I'm just going to group them together and say it's not going to matter. None of those changes matter right now. Maybe they lead into something bigger in a little bit, but nothing that they did on that patch is going to dissuade teams from wanting to pick Sej, Vi, or Wukong if they hadn't already, you know, wanted to do that, right? The same teams that want to prioritize them highly are going to continue to prioritize them highly. And then really the nerf that I think is going to, I don't want to say matter the most, but is going to actively affect how the champion is played the most is probably going to be Annie's nerf from 13.7. Her E was nerfed quite a bit. That's the shield, and, you know, that's going to change a lot of the playstyle that I think we're seeing. I think support Annie got a lot weaker with that change. I think we're probably not going to see her nearly as much in that flex role. It's probably just going to be exclusively mid lane now. And then we've actually been seeing a lot of LCK pros, I talked about this in the playoffs, maxing E second in mid lane as well. I think that's going to go down in viability a lot. I think her damage is still going to be fine in the mid lane. I think in the mid game, she's still going to be a problem on flanks, and the ultimate, you know, with the stun and the damage that she's able to pull out, still going to be incredibly valuable. She's still going to be a top tier mid lane pick, but I think we could see her be a flex pick a lot less often on this patch. But outside of that, again, I really just don't think that there were a lot of nerfs. There really weren't a lot of buffs either. This is going to be a relatively similar looking patch to what we had throughout the spring split, and I think a lot of teams are going to be excited about that. Maybe the fans, not so much. And so, you know, now that we've covered the buffs and the nerfs, it's time to get into each position individually, talking about my tier 1 and tier 2 picks for each. But jumping into each position individually, of course, we're going to be going top to support, and that means we're going to be kicking off our analysis with top lane. And up on the screen now, you're going to see my top lane meta tier 1 picks. These are the picks that I consider to be the ones that probably are going to get fought over the most common picks in the top lane, things that are going to be a little bit more meta-defining, I would say, than the tier 2. We'll get to tier 2. You know, obviously, each tier 1, each tier 2, they're not going to be the same size between each of the positions. Some positions might be a little bit more flexible in terms of what they can pick, and some might be a little bit more like, these are the strong picks, these are what you're going to see early on, but we'll get into each individual one when we talk about each individual position. For top lane, my 4 tier 1 picks are going to be Sion, K'Sante, Jace, and Kennen. I think these are going to be the 4 picks that really define the meta. We've kind of seen this throughout the split so far. I think especially Sion, K'Sante, and Kennen, I think those are going to be your 3 big picks. K'Sante just because he's ridiculously strong, and I think he fits into basically any comp that you want to run. Sion because I do think he's the most consistent pick in the entire game right now. I think in any role, you can slap a Sion to any team comp. You can just kind of leave him alone up there in the top lane, and he's gonna be Sion in the late game. Like, there are very few circumstances in which you just don't want a Sion on your team unless you want to carry through top lane. I think Sion's going to be the default pick. That's why I have him at the top of this ranking. They're not ordered by any means, but Sion, in my opinion, is definitely most consistent top lane, followed by K'Sante, and then the Kennen. If you do want something that can be a little bit more aggressive in the early game and has, more team fight potential in the late game, I think Kennen's going to be a big option for that. Carry top lane oriented teams mostly like BLG, I think, definitely come to mind, are going to be pulling out the Kennen, I think, a lot more than, the Sion or the K'Sante, because those are, while they can be important picks, K'Sante in particular can make a pretty big impact in the late game. They're not going to be able to dominate the end of the game and really have the same kind of agency that a pick like Kennen has, and so I would expect those 3 to be kind of the meta-defining picks in the top lane, but Jace is going to be in my tier 1 as well, if only because if you're looking for that early aggression, you're going to pick Jace, and there's a lot of, players at this tournament that love to play Jace. Mad Lions Chasey comes to mind, T1 Zeus comes to mind, and so a lot of players that I think really like Jace. I think he's going to be a pretty highly contested pick. I think that his flexibility, his mid-top flexibility is also a plus. Flex picks are always going to be prioritized a little bit higher, but Sion, K'Sante, Kennen, definitely the top 3, and then Jace, I think, kind of finds his way there into that, next tier. And then moving on to tier 2, these are picks that I do think we're going to see at MSI, relatively consistently, but they're not going to be quite as meta-defining. They're going to be limited a little bit more to counter picks or to, specific team comps. And my top lane tier 2 is on the screen now. It's going to be Jax, Gwen, Gragas, and Malphite. Changes to Malphite, I think, aren't enough to push him out entirely. I thought he was tier 2 before, maybe top of tier 2 before the changes. I do think that, maybe you get a little bit scared by the armor shred and, by the W changes, but I think for the most part, teams are still going to be willing to pick him up, especially into heavy AD comps, because we've got a lot of tanks, because we've got, because we've got Sion, because we've got K'Sante. Gwen is definitely still going to be meta. You're going to be seeing situations where she gets pulled out as a counter pick to those options. She's just not going to be consistent enough because you can pick, things like the Kennen into her and feel pretty confident about it. Gragas, gonna be a pretty big flex pick, I think, across multiple different positions in this tournament. Obviously, we've seen it a lot mid lane, we've seen it top lane. Wanted to put it tier 1. It was actually in my tier 1 for quite a while before I was making this video, but I ended up dropping it down to tier 2 because while I do think it's going to be influential, while I do think that the pick is going to be showing up a lot, I actually think it's probably going to go mid more than it goes top, and that's really just kind of the end of the story for me. And then Jax as well. I just think if you want to play Jax, like, you're going to be able to play Jax. He's going to be the exact same champion that he has been pretty much the entirety of spring. If you get super fed on him, he's going to be really difficult to stop, both in a side lane and in team fights, but, not a lot of teams have really been going to that top lane carry playstyle, and so he's not going to jump up to tier 1. I do think he's probably the best at that role in the game right now. There's no Fiora on this list, but I do think Jax is still probably a little bit lower tier than some of the more consistent ones that we're going to be seeing in tier 1. But overall, top lane is just going to be more about matchup than it is going to be about, the power picks. I think outside of Sion and K'Sante and maybe even Kennen, there really aren't a lot of picks that I think are going to be slammable. We're going to see Gragas flexed all over the place, but Gwen's going to get some counter picks. Malphite's going to get some counter picks. Jace is going to get some counter picks. There are a lot of champions that I think can be playable in the top lane right now, and I think these are just 8 of the few that I think are going to be on that list. And then jumping into the jungle meta now, up on the screen is going to be tier 1. It's going to be the same 4 champions. I wish I had some parity here in the jungle, but I just don't believe it's going to happen. It's the same 4 champions we've seen all year long, and I expect them to be the same 4 champions that continue to dominate this meta at MSI. We've got Vi, Wukong, Sejuani, and Maokai. I just don't really see a lot of adaptation coming out. I think that, obviously, we'll talk about tier 2 in a second. There are some champions that I think could get more play than maybe, is expected at this tournament, and, you know, maybe in certain matchups are going to be a little bit more viable, but that's what Tier 2 is for. Tier 1, these champions are going to get picked blind, and they're going to be, you know, kind of forced onto team comps, and I totally understand why. It's because they offer everything that you want out of a jungler right now. Fast clear, decent early game, and facilitation for what is an incredibly strong AD carry role and an incredibly strong mid lane role right now, and so I totally get it. I just think in terms of the outlook of, you know, how the rest of the roles end up going, I still think facilitating and more, you know, I don't want to say engage-oriented junglers, they're going to be more valuable than the champions that are going to be dealing a lot of damage out of that position. Vi, in my opinion, is still going to be the queen of that jungle. Even if I don't believe she's the strongest pick, I think teams are still going to value her at the top of that chart. I think Sejuani is the strongest jungler in the game. I think she offers basically everything that you could want. I think the nerfs really don't matter at all to her. I think she's still going to be able to deal with a lot of these champions in the same way, and you know, I think her early game's underrated. I think her late game is underrated as well, in the sense that it's just the best out of all these, maybe with the exception of Maokai, but Maokai is definitely more of a setup champion. I just think Sejuani's really good, and if it were me, if I was a coach, I'd be prioritizing her about as highly as any other champion in the game. And then Wukong and Maokai. I mean, we've seen these basically since Worlds last year. Wukong just gives you super consistent initiation in the late game, gives you a little bit more aggression in the early game. Like, Vi and Sedge can definitely make plays in the early game, but Wukong does a really good job actually trading with the Vi and trading with the Sejuani, getting that pressure in the early game. He's kind of the de facto early game jungler, which is crazy to say considering he's Wukong, but in terms of the meta right now, he's just going to be the one that gives you the most active pressure in the early game. And then Maokai, kind of the opposite. He's going to be permanently scaling into that late game, gives you amazing objective control towards the back half. If you are ahead and you have Maokai and you can control Baron Pit, or you can control Dragon Pit, and you can control River, and you just send out that ultimate, it makes team fighting them and trying to fight into that team incredibly hard. Obviously, I don't need to explain that to you guys. You've seen so much of these picks over the past year or so. Unfortunately, I just don't think that there's going to be a lot changing in that regard. These are probably still going to be the 4 best junglers in the game, but that moves us on to Tier 2, and I only have 3 listed here, but there are a couple more that I want to mention as like a de facto Tier 2.5. The ones up on the screen now, Lee Sin, Nidalee, and Lilia. I think these are really intriguing picks, the ones that I wanted to put on the graphic because I think they're the ones I want to talk about the most. Lee Sin, couple of really good Lee Sin players at this tournament. Nidalee, couple of really good Nidalee players at this tournament. Lilia, a couple of players who really like Lilia at this tournament. And so for me, that's kind of where I went with this Tier 2, is I think there are a lot of champions that are playable in the jungle right now. Some champions that I didn't mention that are going to get picks and plays at MSI. Jarvan, I think, you know, we've got some Jarvan players, but I think for the most part, still going to be a relatively good pick. And then Bel'Veth, obviously Jitsu going, they've played a shit ton of it, and Bel'Veth has kind of risen in popularity over the last few months. Those are some champions that I would consider Tier 2.5. But I would say these 3 are the 3 that I would expect to see the most out of that grouping of champions. Lee Sin really shouldn't take a lot of explaining. Pros have been back on the Lee Sin train, even though the changes to him were minuscule at best. Pretty much any reason to play Lee Sin, pros are going to take. He did get nerfed on 13.7, but I didn't think it was consequential or influential enough to even bring up in the nerf section. I just don't think it matters all that much. I still think he's going to be a pick that if you want to play Lee Sin, you're going to be able to pull him out. He's going to be a good counter to stuff that wants to scale into the late game because of that early pressure, but, you know, we're going to see some other champions kind of vie for that role, and I think Nidalee and Lilia are definitely going to be in that conversation, especially with Lilia's clear getting enhanced, with Cosmic Drive getting enhanced. I think that there are a lot of reasons to like both of these champions on this patch. First of all, we've got a lot of really good Nidalee players going to MSI. June's going to be at MSI. Owner's going to be at MSI. There are a lot of players that love this champion going to this tournament, and I think that that's definitely going to increase the desire to play this champion. I think the changes don't necessarily matter, but Cosmic Drive, I think, could theoretically matter if you did want to build it on Nidalee. I definitely think that's an option, but for the most part, I think it's just mostly players that make me feel comfortable that this champion is at least going to get some play at this tournament. And then Lilia, one of the champions whose changes I think actually matters, probably the champion whose changes matter the most to me, in my opinion, maybe outside of a mid laner that we talked about earlier, and we'll get to in a bit, but, you know, I just wanted to throw her on here because there's very little opportunity for me to talk about the champions that were actually buffed this patch in this segment. And I do think Lilia is going to get play. Players like Yike pulling out Lilia, definitely going to be a possibility. He's played quite a bit of it over his career, and I think it's definitely an option. This, you know, G2 team has definitely not been shying away from going to some more aggressive mid lane picks, or some more aggressive jungle picks with some more passive mid lane picks. I think that could definitely translate to a Lilia pickup at MSI here. But Lee Sin, Nidalee, Lilia, just kind of the ones I wanted to mention. But like I said, Jarvan, Bel'Veth, I mean, there's a ton of other picks that I think could definitely be pulled out here in the jungle. I think the top 4 are relatively solidified, and we're probably going to see them in like 75 to 80% of the games, but this tier 2 is definitely full of champions that I think make it a little bit more interesting. And then moving on to mid lane, this is probably going to be the most difficult one to talk about in the entire video because I really do think that mid lane is the most expansive role, but on the screen you're going to see the tier 1 picks for me. I'm only going to put 3 champions in tier 1. Don't worry, we're going to have quite a bit in tier 2. There's just a lot of champions in the mid lane that I think could be playable, and even some that I didn't even put on any of these graphics that we'll talk about. But tier 1 for me, it's going to be Annie, it's going to be Ahri, and it's going to be Cassiopeia for me. I wanted to get to at least 3 in tier 1. Annie and Ahri really feel like the 2 that are going to still be locks. They were the locks throughout playoffs in pretty much every single region, and I expect that to continue here at MSI. I think they're just kind of on a different level, but I wanted to put a 3rd here in tier 1 just with how many champions that I have in tier 2, and what I ended up on was Cassiopeia because I really do think when you're looking at late game hyper carries coming out of the mid lane role, which I think as a playstyle is just increasing in popularity right now, pretty much with every team across the world, I just think that Cassie does that job better than the rest. I think obviously champions like Azir have not really been all that popular over the course of the year, but we've seen Cassiopeia's popularity rise over the course of the last few weeks, and I would expect that to continue here at MSI. I think if you're looking for someone you can play for in the mid lane, maybe someone you can leave alone in the early game, but someone that's going to give you so much damage and so much consistency in the late game, Cassiopeia is just that pick for me right now. I know everybody's not going to agree on that, but I really, really like Cassie in the meta. I still think Annie and Ahri are the top 2 picks. They just give you everything you want. Ahri can be aggressive. She can be an assassin, but she can also be a CC bot if you want to go that build. She can be more survivable and, you know, more of a playmaker rather than I guess, damage threat, but Annie also offers very similar versatility, I would say. She can very much go full damage, she can go full burst, or she can go a lot more supportive. I think both builds right now for her are relatively viable. They've been viable, and there's a reason these 2 are just the most high prio mid laners in the game. But I think Cassio should be at least considered in that upper tier as well, even if she isn't necessarily considered there right now in terms of pick rate. Then we move on to my tier 2, and there's going to be a few more champions that I mentioned that aren't listed here, but these are the ones that I definitely want to shout out. Gragas, Veigar, Syndra, Lissandra, Jace, and Azir for a bunch of different reasons. Couple of flex picks on here in Gragas and Jace that we've already talked about a bit in the top lane rankings. They're going to be on here for similar measures. Flex picks are just super valuable in League of Legends, and both of these are the 2 best in the game right now. Gragas could also theoretically get flexed into the jungle. If you want to run something like Yasuo, who did get buffed on 13.7, that's certainly something that you can consider, but I would consider Gragas more of a solo laner and Jace definitely more of a solo laner, and I think both of them are going to get play in the mid lane just because of that flex versatility, but neither I think are all that dominant. Obviously, with Mad Lions going to MSI, Gragas is definitely going to get some play in the mid lane. That's been their best pick over the year so far, but it's still just generally valuable to talk about these 2 champions because of the versatility that they offer any team that wants to go for them. The rest are a little bit more understandable. Veigar, Syndra, Lissandra, definitely more common picks in specific matchups. Veigar going to do relatively well as that scaling burst pick, very similar to what I was talking about with Annie, kind of in the late game, but much more damage-oriented. If you want more of a burst style that's a little bit more control-oriented, still offers a little bit more outside of that. Syndra definitely has been propping up in terms of popularity over the past few weeks. I think Syndra is a really interesting pick. And then Lissandra, always going to be a really good pick when Ahri is in meta because she does so well into Ahri. That's going to continue to be a pick that rises. Obviously, there are some things on here that were popular across playoffs, not like ridiculously crazily popular, but definitely some things that are worth noting. Things like LeBlanc, things like Talia, you know, champions like that I think are still going to get play. Yasuo is definitely going to be in the consideration. You know, we've seen Caps play Sejuani or whatever, Zach mid. You know, there are a lot of things that I think could be pulled out in the mid lane, but these are the things that I think are going to be the most consistent. And then Azir does jump up onto this list. He's been basically completely zoned out of the meta, but the changes I think are enough to at least get pros thinking again about the champion on 13.7. I think with his late game power increasing and that being progressively more and more what people are trying to go for in the mid lane, we saw that throughout the playoffs, basically in every region, that the longer playoffs went on, they, teams wanted more damage out of their mid lane spot. I think Azir definitely holds a place in this meta, and I think, I would be remiss to not at least mention him considering he's Azir getting buffed right before a big international tournament, and, that champion, if he's even remotely playable, is always going to be near the top tier of mid laners picked, but there are just so many mid laners in the meta right now that I think have, priority. I think when you're talking about, positions going into MSI, mid lane's going to be the hardest to pin down because I really do think it's going to be up to players and what they feel comfortable on and teams and what kind of style they want to go for, but there are just a lot of options on the table right now. And then moving on to the bot lane, looking at tier 1 now, it's going to be, again, I hate to say it, the same tier 1 champions that we've seen basically throughout all of playoffs. There really were no changes to any of the major bot laners. Zeri got a little bit of a nerf, and Jinx got a little bit of a nerf, but it's certainly not enough for them to be pushed out of the meta. Tier 1 for me is going to be Xayah, Zeri, Jinx, and Aphelios. They're going to continue to dominate. They're going to continue to be the 4 AD carries that are prioritized above basically everybody else. There are a couple ADs that we'll get to in tier 2 that I think could be interesting options, but these are the 4 that you're going to see really consistently throughout the tournament. Xayah, to me, is the best champion in the game right now. She's the most valuable champion in the game. I think maybe outside of Cassante or perhaps even like a Sejuani. There's just no first pick in the game that's going to be as consistent as Xayah. She can fit into any team comp. She's good early. She's really good late. It doesn't really matter, especially with the rest of the meta right now being more hyper carry focused champions that aren't necessarily at their strongest in the early game. Xayah's going to be lane dominant in basically any matchup. If you can get her with Rakan, that's obviously great, but she's shown to be just as effective with Nautilus, with Blitzcrank, with a lot of different, engage-oriented supports. Leona getting that buff might be a little bit more interesting. There are a lot of things that can make Xayah really good, and to me, she's still going to be the queen of the AD carries. I've been saying that throughout playoffs, but Zeri, Jinx, Aphelios still going to be massive. Late game hyper carries are still ridiculously valuable because the game is just not all that fast right now. Look at the junglers that are in play. A lot of them are facilitators, and a lot of them don't necessarily have the most dominant early game ganking, potential. The games aren't usually over by 10 minutes, and we definitely saw that in playoffs. The amount of comebacks that we have seen throughout LoL esports over the past month have been absolutely ridiculous, and a lot of that is because late game hyperscaling AD carries are still really strong. Zeri and Jinx receiving minor nerfs, but certainly not enough to change the power that they have been able to show over the last few months. Zeri is still going to be the most consistent in the late game, if only just because of her survivability. If you can play her at a high level, you're just not going to die, and you're going to be able to output a ridiculous amount of damage. Jinx has a little bit more to do in the early game, and still absolutely can dominate late game teamfights, but does require a bit more peel, and I would say the same thing for Aphelios. He's somewhere in the middle of those two. He's not necessarily as great in the early game as Jinx is. Not, I wouldn't say great, because she's not great. She's good enough, right? Aphelios isn't as good in the early game as Jinx is, but he doesn't have, like, the late game, movement potential that someone like Zeri has to just be able to self-peel. He kind of needs a little bit of both. That's why he comes in at the bottom here, but again, Aphelios Thresh has been so dominant over the course of playoffs. We're going to see these 4 champions, and these are the 4 that I think are really going to define the bot lane. I do think that there are other options, though, as we see in my tier 2. I have 4 listed here, but again, it could be more. I've got Varus, Lucian, Kai'Sa, and Kog'Maw listed here. Kog'Maw's maybe a little bit ambitious that the changes are actually going to get him into the meta. I'm certainly not sold of that happening, but I wanted to include some of the champions that got buffed in this rundown, but really it's Varus and Lucian that deserve to be here in tier 2. Varus for that early game pressure, and then obviously just the safety that you get offered with, poke Varus in the late game, and then Lucian for, that early game pressure in that same vein, but really trying to take advantage of it. I don't think either of these 2 champions are on the same level as the late game hyper carries or Xayah, in my opinion, right now, if only just because I think if they hit that mid game and they're not super far ahead, they're just not going to have any sort of pressure in the late game. And with the amount of, long games that we're getting and the amount of games that are going past 30 minutes, it just doesn't seem all that viable in the meta to consistently pick them up, but in certain matchups, they can be incredibly useful. Lucian, especially, is definitely going to get played at this tournament. Varus, I think, will also get played, but I don't think he's going to be nearly as high prioritized as some of the hyper carries. And then Kai'Sa and Kog'Maw, they are hyper carries, but they're just not quite as good as the other ones right now. Kai'Sa just doesn't have the consistency. I think that the support meta obviously isn't in her favor. Having to go into a Lulu or something like that almost every game is not great for Kai'Sa, but she can still carry games. She can still be influential, and that's why I put her on this list. Even if I don't think she's going to get the same kind of play that anybody in the top tier 1 is, and that I don't think, it's probably not the same as Lucian or Varus. And then, like I said, Kog'Maw could theoretically get on some people's radars. I'm just not really expecting it. There are more champions like Ezreal that I think could theoretically be in this conversation as well. But again, just not picks that I'm expecting to be pulled out more than once or twice at the tournament. There are theoretically some things that you could pick, but tier 1 especially is just so loaded right now in terms of the power that they have at the AD carry position that I would expect those 4 to dominate. And at the very least, these 4 to, cross teams' minds in terms of what is able to be picked. And then we get to our support rankings, and this one's going to be basically the opposite of all the ones we've mentioned so far. Up on the screen now is going to be Tier 1, and this is the biggest Tier 1 by far of any of the tiers, and that's because I think support can just go in so many different directions, mostly because all of these supports are really good at what they do, but they all offer something different, and so it really is just about what kind of direction you want to go in. My Tier 1 is going to be Nautilus, Thresh, Renata, Lulu, Blitzcrank, and Rakan. I don't think any of them can be dropped down to Tier 2. I think all of them are picked, like, priority picks in certain circumstances, depending on the circumstances. The one that I think is going to be the most consistent over the course of the tournament is probably Nautilus up in the top lane. He's just the best engaged support right now, and we all know that if given the opportunity to pick between enchanters and engagers, the teams are just going to prioritize engagers. They're more fun to play, they give you more options, they let you be more aggressive, especially in the early game, and I think that Nautilus just does that job better than anyone, or at least more flexibly than anyone. You can draft Nautilus with basically any of the late game hyper carries. You can draft him with Xayah. Every single one of the top tier 80 carries in the game right now would appreciate having a champion like Nautilus, whether that be for engage, whether that be for peel. He can basically do it all, and I do think that he gets highest priority because of that, but every other champion on this list right here is still going to be useful. Lulu, in particular, is probably going to be number 2. It's Nautilus and Lulu that are going to be the two big ones, but Thresh with the Aphelios, Renata getting pulled out if they want a little bit more, I don't know, aggressive enchanter play. Blitzcrank we've seen a lot, especially out of teams like BLG, who are at this tournament, and then Rakan. I mean, Xayah's on the board, and when Xayah's on the board and Rakan is also as strong as he is even after the nerfs, he's going to be highly prioritized. Every single one of these champions is going to get significant play here at MSI. I just don't really have a way to separate them. Like I said, I do think if I had to create a top 2, it's definitely Nautilus and Lulu. I do think that they are going to be the two most played champions, but Thresh, Renata, Blitz, and Rakan are all going to get play at this tournament. And hell, Rakan might jump into that top, make it a top 3. Or, Thresh might jump into that and make it a top 3. We know how much pros like playing Thresh, and, maybe Blitzcrank falls. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of how these picks end up, working together and playing off of each other. But to me, these are clearly the 6 best supports in the game, and the 6 that are most likely going to get the most attention. Now, that moves us on to tier number 2, and this is a very small tier 2, what with there being a giant tier 1. I've only got Nami and Leona here, and that's because, while I think everybody in tier 1 is pickable in a lot of different circumstances, hell, like, if, you want to play, like, Thresh with Aphelios, but even if you don't get Aphelios, like, you can play Thresh with Xayah, you can play Thresh, with other picks, right? Like, you can play him with Jinx, right? There is not a lot of negative things that you can play Thresh with. I think Nami and Leona are a little bit more comp dependent. Nami's going to get played with Lucian. If Lucian's picked, Nami's going to get picked. She's not going to get picked outside of that. Lucian's not going to get picked outside of that. They're just not in a place right now where they're going to be able to do that, and so she at least deserved a mention on this list because she's going to get played at MSI, but again, if Lucian comes in at tier 2, then Nami comes in at tier 2, and then Leona with some of the buffs I think could be interesting. Teams, like I said, love playing engagers, and she very well could move her way up into the tier 1, but she hasn't been prioritized like that at all throughout the year. The nerfs to her last year definitely hit her relatively hard, and she just doesn't have a great matchup into some of the other supports in the meta right now, but if Nautilus and Blitzcrank and Thresh are going to be a lot more popular, I think Leona definitely fits better into that meta than into something like the Lulu. I think the damage and the survivability in the early game are going to be influential for Leona, and I think her late game is slightly better than it was before, and so there are positives to say. I think she deserves at least an honorable mention on this list, but I'm still a little bit skeptical about her coming in and immediately being on the same level as some of the other engagers that we see at the support position. But I think overall, this is probably the meta that is going to be the most similar in terms of an international event. I love making these videos for international events, but not a lot of parity between this and the end of Spring Split. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI 2023 Meta Report video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. I wish I had better news to give you other than Meta's probably going to look incredibly similar, but that's truly what my thoughts are. The changes in the last few patches have just been incredibly small, and they clearly don't want to mess with the formula right before MSI. Perhaps we're going to get some changes on 13.9, but they did not happen in 13.7 and 13.8, but I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. Maybe you think a little bit more positively about some of the changes. Maybe some of the champions that were, you know, buffed or nerfed are going to come into meta a little bit more than I'm expecting. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot for me. Lets me know that you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. And then, of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be covering everything MSI related in just a couple of days here. We're going to be releasing my team rankings for MSI, my player rankings for MSI, and my matchup analysis for the play-in stage of MSI. So a lot of great stuff coming up here in just a couple of days. And then, of course, after that, we're going to be covering every single series that happens at the Mid-Season Invitational this year. So hit that sub button, press that bell. It really does mean a lot to the channel. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.